free and natural resources, traditional knowledge, and climate change adaptation. That is to say, indigenous peoples are peoples of the land. In this workshop, we are more focused on landscape, and whatever thing we are discussing around land, you should know that indigenous people are one of the people who contribute much in land safeguards and natural resources. So here we have a group of panelists that will be entertaining you for maybe an hour and a half on specific areas. I myself am Basiru Issa. I am an indigenous pastoralist from Cameroon. I am the technical secretariat for Indigenous Peoples Major Group for Africa. It is a global group, or it's a global platform that works, that is for indigenous people and in issues relating to sustainable development goals. So with me here, I will be the facilitator of this session. With me here, I'll have Gertrude Kenyangi. She is from Uganda and also one of the members of the IPMG. She will give us keynote and will mostly focus on social and political consideration related to indigenous peoples and restoration, rights of women and requirement for sustainability of restoration initiatives. So I think she will bring to us the extensive knowledge that she has had, and also share with us some experiences, and also bring mostly the gender aspect of landscape restoration. Beside her, we have Steve Lowry. Steve Lowry is from C4. He will be talking about importance of tenure and rights for local communities and indigenous peoples in restoration initiatives. So he will glance through, he will move through the different tenure system, because whatever we are talking about, if we don't know the rights and if we don't know the different land tenures, or if whether they are favorable or not, it will be very difficult for indigenous people and local communities who at least needs to have some protections, whose rights exist and need to be protected. So he will come on that. You are welcome, Steve Lowry. After that, we will have Edna Kaptoyo. Thank you for you are here. She's also one of the members of the Indigenous Peoples Major Group. And Edna will be talking about restoration and women, traditional knowledge, decision-making, and some examples from the ground. Most of us, as we know, especially in Africa, we know that women are those who have at least a good mastery of the traditional knowledge. So she will be bringing us that into light. After Edna, we'll have Nathan Mukeregi, Justice. He's also from Uganda. And Nathan, you are welcome. And Nathan will be bringing to us some restoration potentials in Uganda and the impacts of degradation on communities. Because, wherever we talk about restoration, it means that there have been degradation somewhere. And then, there are some potentials maybe that are not well exploited. So I think with him, we are going to see some practical examples from Uganda. And then we will end with Stewart. You are welcome. Stewart is from the IUCN. That is the AFR 100. So he will be talking about implementing the AFR 100, ensuring bottom-up approaches, avoiding mistakes of the past, and implementing the AFR 100 guidelines. So ladies and gentlemen, these are the speakers in this session. And after that, the floor will be given to each and everyone who would like either to ask a question or to compliment or also to share some experiences. So you are highly welcome to this session. We are very delighted to have you amongst us. And we'll go straight to, we will start with Gertrude. Gertrude, you're welcome, and you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Facilitator. Thank you, everyone, for this opportunity to bring local voices to global discourses. Well, restoration refers to the process of managing or assisting the recovery of landscapes and that have been degraded, damaged, or destroyed, more often than not, through human activity. Its major aim, as we understand it, is improving human well-being while reducing environmental risks and scarcities. It must be understood that for restoration to be necessary, it must have been preceded by degradation. That was an inequitable, destructive, and irresponsible use of landscapes motivated very often by greed. And greed, we all know, is a selfish, unquenchable desire to accumulate profit at all costs without due regard for the future generations. It is inequitable because it accumulates the great wealth and sophistication it creates, such as nuclear, electronic industries, and skyscraper cities, in the hands of 1% of the world's population, while it has handed the 90% remaining population food scarcity, abject poverty, and a perpetual state of dependency on the 1%. It's destructive because it has destroyed the values of the so-called least developed. It destroyed our traditional beliefs, culture, institutions, local practices, and extended family networks that were our safety nets. It is irresponsible because it has caused massive pollution and monumental waste of natural resources. Policies, laws, and regulations that existed when the degradation was taking place cannot be allowed to continue during the restoration era because they were clearly defective. It's imperative, therefore, that the policies are assessed and reviewed. Restoration of global landscapes cannot play by the current rules. It's necessary to form new institutions and organizations which specifically take into account the specific concerns of local communities, indigenous peoples, and marginalized groups such as women, youth, people with disabilities, and minorities. The new policies, laws, and regulations must change the underlying rules system and incentive structure in such a way that the process of restoration is gender responsive, participatory, transparent, inclusive, and is accompanied by equitable share of benefits accruing from restoration of landscapes. Participation of women recognizes that women are powerful agents of change, and their leadership is critical in community revitalization and renewable natural resource management. Addressing gender issues during this process acknowledges that women and men have different roles and that those roles shape their gendered needs and consequently equitable share of benefits, and it highlights that both women and men's roles are equally important to realize restoration of global landscapes. All policies in this regard must be gender responsive and redistributive, intended to transform existing gender relations, because our societies are inherently patriarchal in nature. Investments and interventions towards restoration need to conduct gender analysis and build data banks of gender disaggregated data. Restoration cannot pursue a scientific path alone. I know this conference is scientific in nature, but I want to appeal to your understanding that science alone will not deliver restoration. It needs to be carried out in ways that balance social, economic, and environmental objectives, and that the engagement of all relevant stakeholders must be respected. Indigenous peoples and local forest-dependent communities must, of necessity, be recognized as rights holders and not just another form of stakeholders. And terrestrial ecosystems, especially forests, as sovereign spaces rather than multi-stakeholder platforms. I know that assertion of mine rubs people the wrong way very often. Any intervention to sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, halt biodiversity loss, and halt the reverse land degradation must be a human rights-based collaborative venture between the rights holders and stakeholders as partners. It must recognize customary tenure rights of indigenous and local communities. It must respect traditional indigenous knowledge and rights of indigenous peoples. It must protect and avoid involuntary resettlement of forest-dependent communities. We call upon governments to embrace their role of duty bearers rather than act as one of many stakeholders. Governments must ensure that the dignity of the custodians of terrestrial ecosystems are at the center of restoration efforts, and everyone involved in this process has an equal opportunity. The state is duty-bound to ensure that custodians of terrestrial ecosystems know their rights in this process. All investment must be responsible. Every investment must be a collaboration between the rights holders and must be responsible. I clearly spelled out effective grievance redress mechanism in the process of restoration, because there are different people with different abilities involved. There will be grievance. So there has to be a properly documented grievance redress mechanism to arbitrate in the conflict that may ensue in the process. Finally, I'm sure in the efforts to restore landscapes, there has to be accountability, follow-up and review. This follow-up and review can not only look at the hardware, the quantitative, the number of landscapes restored. It must also look at the software, the qualitative, the impact restoration has had on the people. How many have been evicted from forests? What effect has it had on their livelihoods? Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Gertrude, for this introductory keynote. And I think there are at least 5 or 6 key issues that I really retained from your interventions. First of all, there is a need for review of laws and regulations, because you see the laws and regulations that were present during the land degradation, we are not sure that they will guarantee the land after it will be restored, because they were the laws that were present and we might even think that they are the laws that are responsible for, or that we are responsible for land degradation. Another issue is that restoration should be gender responsive. That is, here I think we all agree that the women play a lot of role and a very important role. So, but another issue which is very important that I would really like to mention back again here is that restoration must be a right-based approach. That is, I think that one is very, very, very important, especially for the indigenous people and the forest-dependent people and even the local community. So thank you for this keynote. We will move forward with Steve Lowry. I think you will talk about importance of tenure and right of local communities and indigenous people restoration initiatives. You have the floor.
There we go. Good. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure and honor to be on this panel. I wasn't fully aware of what Gertrude would say, but I really applaud her remarks, and I feel that in some ways I'm here to maybe amplify the very important points that she made about rights. I really want to talk about, and I'll be brief, the paramount importance of rights in restoration, but in virtually every aspect of the lives of indigenous people and other communities. Rights give, secure rights is the foundation of effective local governance. If a community does not have meaningful rights, they will be subject to the control and supervision of other authorities almost exclusively. And this is the problem today, I would argue, still in much of the world. It's this lack of agency that comes from an absence of rights, or because whatever rights people have, they're very weak. Rights to forests are a foundation for making management decisions locally in support of forest landscape restoration and other natural resource management kinds of decisions. Rights enable communities to set priorities about where to plant, what to do with the benefits and the revenues from the sale or distribution of those resources. This is the next point I think is very important. Rights enable communities to negotiate the terms of contracts and arrangements for instance, REDD+ benefits and payment for environmental services benefits. It's the absence of rights that put communities, including indigenous communities, in a very weak position with respect to that negotiation, and with the result that they get not a bad deal. The incentives are insufficient to motivate the kinds of changes in practices and behaviors that the policies envisions. And this, I would argue, is a major reason why REDD+ programs and PES programs fail. And they fail a lot. You know, it's really, one is hard-pressed to find a successful PES program, and the data I will submit bears that out. I really want to applaud or express my appreciation for Gertrude's point about the limitations of multi-stakeholder platforms. I think they're often a weak substitute at best for kind of the notion of participation. Okay, it's about let's participate. Let's everybody participate. But what's really weak is the idea of participation. What does it mean, and who's actually in charge of the multi-stakeholder decision-making at the end of the day? Often the partners who come to these platforms have quite different distributions of power and authority. And that power and authority, when concentrated in, say, a government or a donor, the multi-stakeholder platform can give the impression of equity and fairness and effective decision-making, but it's only an impression, isn't it? Okay. I think we should talk less about stakeholders and more about right holders. It's really about rights. Now, if you want to invite right holders to a multi-stakeholder platform, that's great. And that's desirable, because then you have people with some, greater degree of equitable sort of power and authority. Not a completely equitable degree, but some degree. Rights give people the ability to say no. To say no. That deal is not good, that's not fair, these are our resources, we think we're getting cheated, we have a better idea, this is our idea, let's put that on the table. Rights are the foundation of democracy. And this is what we're talking about here in effective local governance. So I think that we really want to establish the notion that rights is a basis for governance, and governance and rights are a basis for restoration. Gertrude's point about recognition of customary tenure is very, very important. And we see in many settings a greater emphasis on what's called statutory recognition of customary tenure. That is, it has equal standing in law alongside other systems of rights like private property or state property. Okay. And there's often this sort of discourse that, oh, customary rights, they're very weak. They're weak because they're not recognized in law. Customary tenure is very important. Why is it important? It gives, every member of the community has rights to resources and land as a social right. As a social right based on their membership in the community. They're bona fide members in the community. That's a very important right. If you're poor, low income, you don't have to go out to the market to buy land. You have a right that's embedded in your community membership. And we underestimate the significance of this. We should be expanding the scope for customary tenure and not reducing it in many settings. So the next point I want to make is really, and this is partially by way of summary, there's a very important sort of piece of research done in 2015 that looked at success factors in community forestry and took a very in-depth look at community forestry in Philippines, Nepal, and Mexico. Many of these communities were indigenous communities, and they identified 5 success factors. And interestingly, they must have spoken to Gertrude before they wrote the paper, because they're very much in alignment. Number 1 was secure tenure. Okay, you're not going to have successful community forestry if rights are weak or non-existent. That's just a fact. It's just not, donors, government agencies, we're going to do a community forestry. Oh, but we'll get to the rights question later. It's not going to work. It hasn't worked. The evidence is overwhelming. Number 2 is equitable distribution of benefits. This is collectively owned land, held land, and everybody in the community has to perceive that, well, benefits are being fairly distributed as sort of an indicator of the legitimacy of the local governance system. Okay. A third one is effective local, governance arrangements, community user groups, local government, and so on. 4th is government support. That's important. It's got to be positive. It's got to set a legal and regulatory environment. It can invest in capacity development. And 5th is conflict mitigation, because often, communities are divided and they need to work on overcoming those conflicts in a systematic way. But of those 5, there are 2 that are essential of the 5. And those 2 are secure tenure and equitable distribution of benefits. The other ones you can sort of manage, but if you don't have those 2, then it's not going to be successful. It's a very important study. I'd be happy to give reference to it. So let's see, just to wrap up here. Well, maybe I should leave it there. Maybe I think I've spoken long enough, and I have some other points to make that sort of are off the point. Okay, there we go. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Steve Laurie, for your interventions. And I think there are some issues that he started mentioning at his introduction, but there are other 2 important issues that we really need to understand. The first is that degradation has already caused negative impact on communities and indigenous people. And now we see climate impact worsen this restoration. And now restoration needs to build resilience and help communities to adapt. I was one time in reading one book and I came across one sentence that caught my mind, where there was an interview on one indigenous lady, and she said, we protect the land and you destroy the land. So I think this caught my mind very well, because indigenous people think that, no, not that they think. Indigenous people knows that heavy investment at times comes with land degradation. There are so many people trying to restore land today, so many donors trying to restore land today, but I don't know how we are going to fight about the impact that we already there are now linked with climate change, because there is nothing that we can talk today without bringing climate change on board. So I think this one too need to be taken into consideration. The second issue, restoration is not just about mitigation and reducing carbon. It needs to be about helping communities adapt, enhance biodiversity, and other non-carbon related benefits. So I think all these issues need to be taken into consideration, and maybe those who will be intervening will really like you to link also your interventions into climate change and maybe issues on mitigation. So I think all these issues are interlinked, and especially with indigenous people and local communities, whom whenever we talk about climate change, they are the first people who feel the impacts. So Etna now you have the floor to tell us a bit about restoration women, traditional knowledge, decision making, and some ground examples.
Thank you, moderator. Good afternoon. First, I would like to say I'm happy that you're all here, and also the fact that I would like to say that I'm also a Global Environment Facility Indigenous Peoples Fellow on climate change, so it's an inaugural fellowship platform. And one of the areas of work I took up to continue doing is really supporting indigenous women in terms of undertaking community-based adaptation and mitigation initiatives, and really empowering indigenous women at different levels where I work. And I'd like to thank the two previous speakers, because they've really set the pace in terms of the discussion and the key issues for indigenous peoples when it comes to landscape restoration, whether it's on forests and so forth. And I'd like to also say that for indigenous women, we had put the title that we are the peoples of the land. And for the indigenous women, they are part and parcel of the land. And when I work with the women in the community, they say people cannot talk about protecting forests, protecting land, doing conservation, without as well protecting women and understanding that women are also part of that landscape and they need to be considered. And we know women are form more than half of the population. So it's a critical mass that needs to be involved in landscape restoration, and Gertrude has alluded to that. And also they hold key traditional knowledge, they have different interests, experiences, because they interact with it daily when they are working within the community, because most of our indigenous women depend on that. And I think on landscape restoration initiatives need to capitalize on that knowledge. It's important. They have specific knowledge on key species, whether on what species to plant, what can work in a particular area when, for instance, men do not have within that community. And our indigenous women's group are organized from the community level, local level, up to the international level. And that's a platform and a movement and community groups that can provide support and also bring about this transformative change that we want to see in terms of restoring landscape. As well, when we're talking about landscape restoration, we should look at it as a wide spectrum. It's not only about trees, we were told in the opening plenary. We have to see things on rights, there's issues of sustainable livelihoods, there's the cultural aspect, the sacred significance for communities, energy issues, water, and these are all important issues for indigenous women, and that's what, and also political issues and policy as well aspect. And since 2015, 14, up to last year, we've been doing a lot of, with other partners, an initiative called Community Conservation Resilience Initiative. And a bigger component involved undertaking gender analysis at the community level in terms of assessing resilience capacity, and also the initiatives that were there, and also for community really to do a visioning. What do they want to do within their landscape? And we did one, a number of people did. We had in other regions in Asia, in Pacific, we had in Kenya, we had in DRC Congo, and also other parts of Southern Africa. And most of the outcomes that came as a result of that initiative, we saw that a lot of women are doing a lot of initiatives which are successful and sustainable. And second as well, that these initiatives exist, and there are a number of them, and also it demonstrated that women were leading a lot of initiatives that needed to be acknowledged, that this needs to be scaled up and also supported so that it can go to a higher level. And of course, the community groups as well acknowledge the fact that women hold this key traditional knowledge, and they're also supporting a lot within the community. And of course, we have to know that even though there's different contributions, small pockets here, these are what contributes to the global change when they are added up, and so they are critical. And I would like to give an example. For instance, in Kenya, where we work, like in Transmara region, we have women who have set up small micro enterprises really that's focused on forest landscape restoration, and they're really doing it within communities. And Kenya government, we had the president issue a greening school initiative, and women have been keen. Most areas, they'll send messages and they'll reach out to school and create awareness and do all those initiatives. It's them leading because they say they want to create the change, and they started at the household level. So despite the gaps and the challenges that you see within the women in terms of customary rights, who owns land, who's going to do restoration, and who owns it later or benefits from it, we still see a number of initiatives that women are doing and undertaking, and also are developing within their community life plans. And also we have examples like we have in Masai Mau area, we have a community forest user group called Nkutuk Team, and a bigger part of the leadership is women groups, and it has 24 women groups who are part of it, who are really supporting the conservation and the restoration of the forest within the region, because they saw we needed to support the water catchment areas as well, and also support communities in terms of having alternative energy uses, because they saw this was a challenge. And they've been able to restore more than 10,000 hectares, and that's commendable despite the challenges that are there. Also in Marsabit, we see Indigenous Women Group also organizing in terms of conserving their savanna landscape and the dry lands, and also bigger water catchment areas like the Mount Marsabit, which is a critical habitat for key species. But I think one factor that is a key enabler for in terms of success in this initiative that the women have been implementing is because they have been in those leadership positions, so that they're able to participate in decision making, in designing, and also implementing in terms of community vision plans, and also inclusion in the community structure. Those were the enablers in terms of why those initiatives works. And also, I think as a key message, what I'd like to say, like, empowerment of women should be key, in terms of ensuring a successful landscape restoration, and also in terms of supporting the effective participation in initiatives that are there, and moving beyond policy. Like, for instance, Kenya has this Community Land Rights Act that was passed. It's very good. We have very good policy, but I think the challenge is moving beyond policy and looking at what are the enabling framework and structures. For instance, we have the community forest user groups, which can be a good platform for women to engage at that local level, and that can be an entry point to ensure sustainability as well. And of course, what Stephen had talked about in terms of having the right-based approaches in terms of ensuring inclusion, not only in terms of participation, but moving beyond that participation. And I think I'd stop there in terms of my explanations here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edna, with these practical examples, with these good practices. But I think there is a very important issue that she mentioned at the beginning of her intervention, is that whenever we want to do protection, women are part of the issues that we should think to protect. So I think this one is very, very, very important. And the second issue is that what we can see, indigenous people are very, very organized, from the local level to the global level. So I think this one is an issue which is very, very interesting with indigenous people. Another issue is the concept of cultural protection, because whether we want to restore the landscape, I think another issue that we really need to take into consideration is that what we are doing, it is not destroying the cultural or the cultural setting of the people of which we are working with. Another one is, like the knowledges on women initiatives. I think all over the world, or the indigenous people, they have so many initiatives that they have created, that they are running, and these ones need also to come on board. Another last issue that I captured in your intervention is the empowerment of women, because whatever we are doing, I think capacity building and empowerment is a central issue. Because, if we can restore landscape today, but if we don't empower the community, especially women, if we don't do much capacity building, we might go back to some practices that will lead to degradation. So thank you very much for these your practical examples, and which are very, very appreciated. So now we go to Nathan. Nathan, you will talk about some restoration potentials, and you will focus on in Uganda. Thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Once again, my name is Nathan. I'm an indigenous person from Uganda, and I work for the Coalition of Indigenous Peoples in Uganda. I want to tell you briefly about the restoration in Uganda, but I will first start with the history of Uganda a little bit. I know I don't have time, but I will try to be very brief. In 1920s, Uganda was described as the Pearl of Africa. The reason was, when the then Prime Minister of Britain, Churchill, came in 1920s, Uganda, over 70% was covered by forests and also water bodies. But the situation today is that only 10%, representing 1.9 million hectares, is forests. Remember, it was over 70%. We are only saying that we have lost a large forest cover to human activities and other non-human activities. So what is being done today? The government of Uganda has realized that it is in problems once it has not done forest land restoration. So under the Ministry of Water and Environment, through the Forest Sector Support Department, they have put up plans to restore at least 2.5 million hectares by 2020 of the forests. So of these, Uganda already has identified 8 million hectares to be planted, to be restored by 2030. Although we are doing this, we have the support of the international community, we have the support of IUCN, WWF, the NGOs, and even the local community. But exactly what is going wrong? What is going wrong is that the indigenous peoples, who are mainly the Ik, the Benet, the Batwa, and the Karamajong, are left behind. The government has really not come up seriously to address the forest indigenous peoples that I have mentioned, except recently, under the RED Plus program, the government has realized that these people also exist. But unfortunately, they are very, very behind. So who is suffering most? As I have said, the women, they are suffering most. Why? Our culture in Africa First of all, we underlook women. I'm sorry to say that. But also, women are very poor. Also, to make matters worse, the indigenous peoples were evicted from their lands and they were made protected areas. They are national parks, they are forest reserves. So the indigenous peoples are living in the periphery. So they are very poor. The indigenous peoples are really suffering. They don't participate in most of the national decision processes. It's only in a few processes they participate. So the situation for indigenous peoples is really worrying. So this is why, for example, we are saying that we need more participation of the indigenous peoples in both national processes and international processes. Actually, we give a credit to this process that is taking place here, where the indigenous peoples are represented. So I know in the interest of time, I have also to go and say what should be done. Although I have touched it, but I must say it also more. We need to make sure that we have resources to ensure that the indigenous peoples and the local communities really participate in the forest landscape restoration. Why? Because Uganda normally has an issue of saying that they don't have resources for that. That is, what is available is for development. So unless we get these resources, it will not be possible for us to participate effectively in forest landscape restoration. We also are looking at other issues of the global environment. Uganda needs to be brought on board to ensure that there is a serious participation in other global processes. So as I conclude, I would also talk about the issue of, I think many people have really talked about it. I'm just going to emphasize it, the issue of gender. The issue of gender is a serious issue because women, they do a lot. They are the ones who look for firewood. They are the ones who look for food. They are the ones who do most of the work, while most of our men have shifted. So as a result, women are prone to suffering. And as I talk, there is an issue that is raising in the indigenous communities, mainly the Batwa, the disease called the HIV, stroke AIDS. Because the Batwa women do not have means for survival, they have been relegated to begging. As a result, they go with men who are sometimes HIV positive. So recently, the government report said that 27% of the Batwa community are HIV positive, but the national statistics are saying that only 7% of other communities are HIV positive. So this issue has been, we have lost the forests, and the forests were providing livelihoods. And these livelihoods were the ones that were supporting the Batwa, the indigenous peoples. Therefore, we are saying that once we restore the forests, we restore the forest landscapes, the livelihoods of the indigenous people will improve, and the indigenous peoples will be able to address their challenges, including livelihood challenges, including issues of energy, including issues of getting hubs where they used to go to the forest, but these forests will also give them hubs, including cultural rights, because the indigenous people are known to live with ecology and gain culturally from them. I know I have not prepared, but this is a serious issue that must be addressed not only by Uganda, but by the whole of the international community. With that, I say thank you very much. I will be ready to answer the questions.
Thank you very much, and Nathan. But I think there are some alarming figures. These are issues for most of us who like to work with figures, who make their judgment over figures. Imagine from 1920 to 2018, I think it's exactly 98 years. And in 98 years, Uganda have lost, that is 90% of their forest. That is because by 1920, it was 70%. And now they have just 10%. So it means that they have lost 90% of their former 70% in the 1990s. I think it is an issue of concern. Secondly, there is this issue of poverty. There is a belief, and it is a traditional belief, and it is clear, and it is even scientifically proven in Africa. Those who live at the peripheries are the poor communities. So, and imagine that African indigenous people who depend on forests, because they are mostly called, please note this one, forest-dependent community. And now imagine that there is no forest. Where will they depend to? Or how will they be called? So I think these are issues of concern that not only the government, but the international community, the research centers, that really need to take this into consideration. So I think, and with that, you see the issue of vulnerability. Because when you don't have forests where your livelihood was dependent, you see, because, for example, when he gives figures of at least 27% of the Batwa communities are HIV positive. So imagine that just 15% are women. So these 15% of women are also likely to give 15%, are likely to give birth to 15% of another infected HIV children. So I think these are issues that whenever we are talking about land restoration, we should take that into consideration. And the issues of rights, there should come in, like access to land, the tenure system. Because the problem is that in most African countries, I know maybe there are people from Ogek here. I think they are one of the first to win a process that is to win a case over a land. I think they are in the hall here. But imagine how should it be that indigenous people should always fight for their right. Why must they always fight for their rights? So I think these are issues that are coming in, and these are issues that we really, the international community and the national governments, we need to address. Anytime, and also when you see, even at the international community, at least we see some documents talking about indigenous people fighting for their rights. Indigenous people fighting. So I think these are issues that we really need to brainstorm and see the best way forward. With this, I would like to give the floor to our last speaker from IUCN, Stewart. So you will bring to us about some implementation issues and what were the mistakes and how should we do so that it should not repeat itself. You are welcome to the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to try and address 2 points in the 10 minutes. One is sort of a general reflection on landscape restoration, where it's come from, what it's trying to, where it's specifically sort of what are the, I suppose to say the opportunities and the safeguards actually building into restoration for to protect community rights. And then secondly, I actually just wanted to have a few words about what IUCN is doing specifically, obviously, because that's what we in IUCN can control. So I think maybe to start off with sort of landscape restoration, think about what is new and maybe what's not new. And I think first thing is to actually put on the table that clearly we're talking about land and we're talking about natural resources. So some of the same some of the risks that we know persist, and that's something we actually have to make sure that we are aware of and actively work to address. But I think also one's got to look at the other side as well of the coin and think about, well, what are the opportunities? And maybe starting off certainly one of the big risks and one of the concerns is that restoration becomes a vehicle for another land grab, that you actually see that so companies want to come in or a government wants to come in and you get another series of evictions and et cetera. And we know there are examples of that and cases ongoing. So, but I think the other side is to look at the flip side of this, and it's to start maybe building on Stephen's point about the importance of tenure and rights. And I'd actually say that degradation and land degradation, remember, go back to Gertrude's point, you're restoring something, you're restoring degraded land. Degradation is at least in several locations, is a symptom of alienation of people from their land. And I think there's many examples of that, and you can see. I remember once looking at the history of community forest management in western Zambia, and I think it was the Lunda people for years really they had the most fantastic system of natural resource management, community forest management. The forests were all kept intact. There was actually very little interference by the colonial authorities. And then actually what happened was when after independence they said, no tribes, we're all Zambians, this belongs to the government. And those forests then disappeared. So I think the other thing is actually to look at the alienation and lack of clarity around tenure can actually drive degradation. And then we'll look at this issue of what the cost of degradation is, and we've heard this already. It's actually, degradation impoverishes. Degradation means lower productivity, lower access to natural resources. And therefore, again, I'll go back to the start of the what I'd say is the most recent movement around landscape restoration, which goes back about 20 years or so. And there, several of the key inspirations that were drawn from that were actually community-driven, with the Samburu restoring land in Turkana. The famous Shinyanga story was all driven by local communities. And so what I want to maybe just focus on now is maybe some of the opportunities. Stephen also mentioned the issue of RED Plus, and I must admit, I've actually been a bit of a critic of RED Plus, partly, and partly because I is a next start 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 is a next next start is a 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 next
next
Land is a land which is catered for. And the second one is, you know, when a landscape is being restored, it becomes more attractive. And when it becomes attractive, and most communities, they think that attractive things are not meant for indigenous people. So let them go away, and for us who knows the benefit of it, let's come and look for it and get all the advantages of the attraction. So I think this one too is a really issue that need to be addressed. That is securing land grabbing and land eviction of indigenous people. I think this should be, first of all, the first question that should, or one of the first questions to be answered before we think about land restoration. And the other one is about the impacts, or what we can call the positive impact of landscape restoration, like creating jobs. It gives, that is, it ensures livelihoods. So I think these are issues that are very, very important, but they are very advantageous for the global population, but they give two nightmare for indigenous people. That is land grabbing and land eviction. So thank you very much, each and everyone, for intervening. But as all of you just agreed that none of you talked without mentioning gender. So I think gender is central. Gender is very important. And I think other issue that is very, very important, I think maybe it can come from the floor, is how do we link all this to climate adaptation? So these issues are very important. So thank you very much. Maybe you will have one or two questions to answer, so I please ask you to remain here with us. we will give the floor maybe to Mogudu Kekibila. He's from Botswana. He's one of the indigenous people, the son from Botswana. Then after him, the floor will be open for questions, for comments, or even for observations. Everything is welcome here. King, you have the floor.
Thank you. As he has said, my name is Kikabile Mohodu. I'm from the indigenous communities in Botswana. I think you know them about the God Must Be Crazy. That's how you know them. So it's another topic for another day. I would like to thank the organizers for having invited us. Especially from Southern Africa. You might realize that I might be the only one here from Southern Africa. Might. Yes, there is somebody from behind. I think the panelists have spoken to several issues regarding land, territory, and natural resources. But I think there are a few points that I think I have captured that have not been taken to, but especially when regarding to indigenous people. That is FPIC. I think one mentioned it here, the fair, prior, and informed consent. Because before we talk about restoration, we should know what caused a degradation. And I believe, as you said, is land grabbing, resettlement, and all other those things in pursuit of natural resources in the community. And before we talk about FPIC, I think we have also to talk about this misconception that natural resources and land is owned by government, more especially in Africa. And therefore, because it is owned by government, government can do whatever they want. Government can enter into agreement with any company and go to a community to do whatever they do, disregarding the traditional land tenants system within that community. So I believe when we talk about these issues, we need to talk about the fair, prior, informed consent, that anybody that goes into the community to do whatever they want to do, they need to consult the community. And within the community, if we are to pursue free, prior, informed consent, we need to understand that there are some traditional land tenure systems that are there that the community has been following for time immemorial. So these are some issues that we need to talk about. Lastly, because I'm not a panelist, it's about the traditional knowledge. When you talk about adaptation, we need to understand how community used to live when there are certain areas or certain natural disasters that befell them. So we need also to take into account issues of traditional knowledge or indigenous knowledge that the communities practice time immemorial. So this should be a concerted effort of the government, of pharmaceutical companies, allow me to say that, and multinational corporations, including NGOs and others, to come together with the community. The community should not always at the receiving end, should not always at the periphery. They should be involved, not consulted. I would rather now say involved, because when you consult, it means you're coming some way, talking to the people. But if we can say involved, they should be involved at the onset in whatever is being done in their community with their natural resources. Thank you.
Thank you very much, King. And I think you came up with 3 important concepts. That is the FPIC. The second issue is that of traditional land boundaries. And for those of you who like trees or who like forests, you know that within a given family, in the African context, the boundary between my land and my younger brother's land on my sister's land is a tree that is planted. So you see, it is not just that delimitation, but it is also enhancing the forest. So I think, you see, when the government comes or other people come, when they destroy these beliefs, when they destroy this traditional knowledge, they are not just destroying the knowledge, but they are also destroying the environment. Because what will happen now is that, okay, let's just put a fence and let's start cultivating. So I think this is very, very important. Like, for example, if I go to my village today, I know where my land is. And for example, if I see, and what they do is that they try to put different trees. That is, they collect different species and say, okay, this one is for you. If you see mango is for this one, if you see orange is for this one, and pear is for that other person. So I think that one too needs to be taken into consideration. And the last issue that you mentioned is that conception that every land is owned by the government. But who is the government? The government is made up of its citizens. But mostly in African context, when you say the land is owned by the government, you are indirectly saying that the land is owned by those who have power over the police and the gendarmes, whom if you violate what they say, they will come and catch you. So I think these issues that need to change. The notion of government in Africa, I think it needs to take, because government is there to protect its citizens, but not to expropriate its citizens from where they are living. Or government should also, work towards the desire of its citizens. For example, you will hear in Africa, they say, no, it is written in the Constitution. But who wrote it in the Constitution? And for whom was it written in the Constitution? So all these issues are very, very important when we are talking about landscape restoration. So thank you for that. I don't know whether we have any comment. We still have 12 minutes. Okay, yes, okay. 1, 2, we start with gender, since people were, no, we start with women. Because in Africa, when we talk about gender, people are always in women. Okay, thank you, madam, you're welcome. Introduce yourself and give your comments.
Okay, I'm Messi Mpetakandulu from Zambia. I work with the Forest Department. I've got 3 contributions. The first one is to Nathan from Uganda. The picture painted on the ladies there is quite gloomy, and it brings out the infection rates and the over-dependency on the men, and it doesn't talk really to the capacities of women to manage themselves or on what livelihood activities they are involved in. So, which can then be strengthened to target improving their livelihoods, because they cannot just totally be dependent on the men. So the picture was gloomy, and it makes me sad. The next one is on the ownership. I think policies need to encourage ownership, because women may feel interested in contributing to forest restoration, but again, you find that the cultural aspects where most of the trees, especially planted trees or trees that are valuable, are owned by a man. And in case of a man dying or a marriage breaking up, this woman has got no ownership to that, and they have no control. So somehow those cultural, inclinations, tend to disadvantage the women such that they feel discouraged even to plant valuable trees that would give them value over time. Then on steward, I think there was a mention of Northwestern province of Zambia, where people were conserving trees in the colonial days, and that has changed over time. I think what was not brought out was what kept the forest there. I worked with those people for quite some time. The people of Northwestern Zambia are traditional beekeepers who relied on the forest for the honey production, which reached almost 6,000 tons, and they clinched a niche market on the European Union. They had associations which were formed from group up to district and provincial level, and they were trading very well for honey with the EU and for beeswax with the Portuguese. That market was a bigger incentive because they were able to certify the forest and the honey. That helped them to conserve the forest because they were interested of their honey being accepted, because the chain of custody was really followed up to the source. So with that market broken, then people still are producing, but they're not exporting as associations. So what keeps the forest in Northwestern province is mainly the activities that the indigenous people there and the traditional rulers have. The attachment they have to the forest is what keeps them, because no government would not tell them. Them themselves have got rules and regulations on how they keep the forest over time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Is that good? First of all, before I begin, I would like to introduce you to a group of indigenous people, Maasai from Amboseli. They came here especially to be here, and they will be in a side event tomorrow afternoon called White Mountain. I would like to speak to the idea of participation, because I've heard it a couple of times. And in my own experience, in 2015, just before the year before the Paris Agreement, I was reading reports that 98% of the last remaining pristine forests on our planet are being protected by indigenous people. And they're doing a damn good job, often fearing their own lives doing it. I was looking what to do. I thought these people know something that we don't know. It's not something about we need to protect them, because lots of people were doing that, and I was not in that business. I thought these people need to take the lead. They know something that we don't know. And I connected with this man here from the Netherlands Center for Indigenous People, and we paved the way towards Paris to open up a different meeting, gathering with indigenous people from all over the planet, just to tap our resources and our knowledge and our vision of what this planet could look like, and ask them to take the lead. And we sat at that point together with the indigenous elders from all over the four directions of this planet, also from this continent, that we should be supporting the young people, the new generation, and tell indigenous people to take the lead. So in the work that we do, my foundation is called Embassy of the Earth. We work intensively in India, South India, which is also drought-stricken, Tamil Nadu. And now we work here in Kenya and Tanzania. And we always call it community-led livelihood or landscape regeneration. So these people from Amboseli, they actually called me and asked, could you help us? And I came there, and I'm their customer. They are telling me what to do. And of course, there's a huge ring of people who have knowledge and experience and real information that people need. And we have Leo, he's the founder of this free prior, how do you call it, Leo? Well, he's been in this work and helping indigenous people negotiate their land rights for a long, long time. So we're approaching it this way too. The knowledge is there. But the indigenous people are in the lead because I think they have something to teach us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. I didn't ask for this introduction, but thank you. So my name is Leo van der Vlist. I do work for the Netherlands Center for Indigenous Peoples. I'm also related to the Embassy of the Earth, and I'm in the Forest Stewardship Council. One of the challenges we encounter now, because we want to attract investments for the restoration or the regeneration, as we call it, in Amboseli and around Kilimanjaro. And so and the investment is based basically on the value of the timber of the trees for the larger part, because that is what's going to bring the financial returns. But that takes time, 15 to 20 years before the trees grow and bring revenues. So how can you secure land tenure over such a long period? And are there any suggestions from the panelists here how to do that?
Okay, thank you very much, and I think it's very delighting for indigenous people to see that there are people who are coming, looking for them far away in their forests, looking for them and putting them behind. And I think as the Indigenous Peoples Major Group, we would like to assure you of our presence tomorrow in the site event. So I think we'll come there. And we are also very happy that many indigenous people were mobilized to also take part in this global landscape and also take part in this session. We are really delighted for that. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you very much. My name is Jeff Campbell with the Forest and Farm Facility, which is a partnership between FAO, IIED, IUCN, and AgriCord, and our work is really to help support and strengthen people's organizations and producers' organizations. The word organization came up once, but it wasn't emphasized perhaps as much as I think it needs to be. Indigenous people have done a very good job at organizing at the global level. They've even been able to attract some good resources at that level. Where resources have not been focused is at organizations at local level, in their own territories, in their own landscapes, in their own businesses, in their own efforts. And this is something which is absolutely critical, and I think it should be emphasized here that, because if we talk about FPIC, I feel what's much more important is pre-FPIC. That is, Indigenous people should have their protocols ready. If someone comes with FPIC, they say, read our protocols. We already have decided what we want. If you can match those, fine. If not, but do we invest in that preparation? Do we invest in the kind of resources that they would need so that they can make the case? We'll do the restoration. Thank you very much. We can do it ourselves. So I think there's a lot of investment that's needed in capacity building and helping to make this, speak the language of those who have power and money and control sufficiently not to change cultural practices, but to make sure that the power dimension gets shifted. So I think strengthening the organizations, traditional and new, of Indigenous peoples is something really, really critical. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe the last question, then we give the floor to the panelists.
Hi, my name is Lisa. I work with the Rainforest Alliance in Southern Africa. And we've been involved in landscape work in Latin America for quite some time, but quite recently in Southern Africa. And I was really pleased to hear from the panelists, everything that you're saying is things that we are doing and thinking about, like involvement of communities, the bottom-up approach, gender. So it's really encouraging to know that there's so much knowledge out there, and I'm wondering, why it's not kind of shared more, as opposed to just in this type of forum, as opposed to reinventing the wheel. I think a lot of us already have the experience and knowledge on how to do a landscape approach. And I just wanted to say, in terms of the gender, we have quite an interesting situation in southern Malawi, where we actually have a matrilineal system. So all the land is owned by the woman. So I know you guys have spoken a lot about ownership, so we already have that box ticked. Now the problem comes in, so the women own the land, and the men don't really want to become involved in investing in that land, and then any benefits that come from the use of that land, the men still control the resources. So it's quite an interesting situation we find ourselves in. So if anybody has some ideas about that, I would be interested to know. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the panelists. Gertrude?
First of all, I want to thank the lady from Zambia. Thank you very much. In fact, you listened to me very well. The question, what you have said is right, but the situation of the indigenous women is what I'm mainly talking about. Most of the indigenous people in Uganda were evicted from their traditional lands, the forests. And when they were evicted, the men went to look for jobs in towns and left their families to children. Imagine leaving 5 children to a woman, and the woman has no land. And remember, these people depend 99% on land. So the situation of a woman, especially an indigenous woman in Uganda, for the Batwa, the Bennett, and the Ik, and the Karamajong, is really gloomy. So it has forced them to survive in ways which are really very bad. But that's why I'm actually pleading that the government of Uganda and the international community should focus more resources on participation of indigenous women. Something special must be done. But I'm not saying that the indigenous men also should be left behind, but the role played by women, particularly in our communities, indigenous people, and in Africa, is far bigger, because men normally move. They move. In fact, when we are celebrating the International Day for Indigenous Peoples, I reflected on that, the movement of Indigenous peoples, how many move to town, move to other areas, and leave behind women. I think the other critical issue which came out is land grabbing, restoration promoting land grabbing. Recently in my country, National Forest Authority advertised that is going to restore 50,000 hectares of land. So 4 applications for indigenous people were taken, they were left out. When I went through the list of people who got land in Uganda, they were rich people who were taking land near the forests. So indeed, indigenous people lost land. I'm very grateful that my friend brought it very well. Also, land tenure system in Uganda is also has issues. The community land is not respected. What is respected is the land with title. So continuously, the indigenous peoples are losing land. I think my colleagues will add. Thank you.
From the can contribute.
Yeah, okay. No. Okay. I just wanted to react. Well, reaction I hear is a negative thing, but I wanted to answer to give an answer to this gentleman in the front who asked about how trees take about 15 years to mature, and how can someone have land tenure for that long? Is that what you said? Yeah, okay. We are in collaborative forest management with the National Forest Authority. I also come from Uganda. And we are a community-based group of women. So I'm just going to talk from the perspective of Uganda. It depends on the land tenure system in place. For us, we are given a few hectares, not as many as Nathan was talking about. What Nathan was talking about has only just happened, and indigenous peoples were left out. But there's a time when we are given collaborative forest management with an agreement signed that must be respected, where we shared roles and responsibilities, where we are given controlled access. Even this was a result of intensive advocacy. So a land tenure system in place is what you can be, is what exists, is what determines how long a tenure will last. Because for us, the rotation, the length of time the trees that we are growing will last, we call it a rotation, is going to be 20 years. And then we have a tree planting certificate. You must be backed by legally recognizable documents, because it's very easy for somebody to say that we've given you our land and then they turn around and take it away from you. So we are some of the people who are planting trees, and if you want to partner with us, you are welcome. In fact, when he was talking, I thought I should invite him to Uganda too, because women are now planting trees seriously. We won the prize for Wangari Maathai from the Collaborative on Forestry of Food and Agriculture Organization. And I'd like to answer the lady from South Africa about the ownership of land. You said that women in Malawi own land, and then the benefits that accrue from the land are controlled by the men. It's a paradox. That means it's a fallacy. They do not own that land. They might own it. You see, to own something, what I understand by it is to be able, if you own it, to make decisions pertaining to that land. And and to have the agency, to utilize the proceeds even from that land without interference whatsoever. But as long as patriarchal systems are in place, we've seen some communities in Africa that are matrilineal, where children inherit from their mothers. A few are there. But again, as long as the entire global system remains patriarchal and men exercise their masculinities, I'm not here to attack the male gender. I'm a great admirer of men. I know that we cannot exist without them. That's why I always promote, when we are doing gender sensitization, to include, to bring together men and women, so that the two, because gender is about men and about women. So what I'm saying, that one in Malawi, as it exists, as long as it's, at least you have the advantage of that one. But I know that gender-based violence escalates when the women try to resist. So we can't really swear, we can't really say that they own the land. It's only in writing, or I don't know what, that they own it, but they don't own it yet. Until such a time as they control the proceeds accruing from that land. So you still need a lot of advocacy, a lot of sensitization for it to become a reality.
Yes.
Just one thing, we was mentioned a couple of times about trees taking 15, 20, 25 years to mature and whatnot, and of course that is correct. But I think actually if we talk about landscape and land restoration, we need to see benefits accruing in a lot quicker time than 15 years. I think this comes back actually maybe to Jeff's point as well, of really sort of being able to support communities so that they are absolutely clear to say, these are the things that we want. Some landscape restoration interventions are actually about being able to access and manage, let's say, neglected forests. So it's being able to, and it's, I've definitely seen that in several parts of the world. So we should remember, landscape restoration delivers multiple benefits, and so there should be different benefits flowing over time. But I think that's something that's really important, and it comes back to the point that our colleague from Zambia highlighted, that with benefits and with flows of benefits, you actually gives a reason for maintaining those resources. And I think actually your point on the risks of land grabbing after restoration is very good. Actually, that, and examples exist on that. In Nepal, when there was restoration, particularly in the Terai of sal forests, the government then changed the taxation policy so that they would get a lot more money once those forests were valuable. But I would actually say that this is why restoration needs to be, that tenure, clarifying tenure and rights needs to be an ongoing process, pre-restoration, during restoration, and actually after the restoration process goes on, so that you can actually address these.
Thank you very much. Edna?
I think
we are 5 minutes to the end of our session. So you move fast. Yeah. Maybe you have some 2 minutes, here some 2 minutes, then I will conclude.
Yeah, I think what I would like to add on from the Rainforest Alliance comment is that, of course, contexts are specific and it needs different tactics on how to address it. And more importantly, I think one lesson we've had in Kenya amongst indigenous women is supporting exchange visits among them, because there are those who've addressed some challenges in terms of land rights, for instance, and those who are still starting, so they're able to learn from the others and see what they can leverage on and improve on. And then, of course, to reiterate that it's important really to look at the community-based, supporting community-based initiatives, because that's where results are realized, and also directing resources to the local level. And I think for the International Indigenous Women's Movement, we've been able to tap onto funding and try to scale it down to the local level, Indigenous women-led networks, but still there's more that needs to be done. And then finally, I would like to highlight the fact that Indigenous women and Indigenous peoples are facing threats, especially the environmental and land rights defenders, and we should remember them and their core. And it's really a big challenge that's happening now even in other countries, and they're even targeting the Indigenous Special Rapporteur on Indigenous people's rights, for instance, like the Philippines government. So we should remember them at the back of our mind and really support advocacy against these threats that are coming up for land rights defenders. Yeah.
And maybe just briefly a couple of more comments on the tenure question. You know, there is an effort in many countries underway to devolve rights in a meaningful way to communities with respect to their control significant levels of management use and other kinds of rights. There's no absolute ownership right anywhere. And the public sector has a responsibility in ensuring that resources are used sustainably and in the larger public interest, or that they're not degraded. And so there's always going to be a need for some kind of regulatory apparatus arrangement. One of the problems, though, in the rights devolution movement is that the forestry agencies, in many cases, not all cases, tend to overregulate to the degree that the actual exercise of the new rights, use, ownership, marketing, other rights, are really quite constrained. This comes back to the Nepal case, where we've been doing research lately with partners in Nepal. Community's got a really nice, strong set of rights, and they've done great things with them in terms of increased forest cover, establishment of new enterprises, and so on. But the regulatory burden is so heavy that it's very difficult for people to really get businesses going, or communities to get businesses going. It's, and another example, I think, and you would know more, Edna, is in the 2005 forest law in Kenya has this great provision for establishment of community CFAs, community forest associations. But there is a requirement there that before people can really exercise rights in a meaningful way, that they have to have a management plan that has to be approved by, guess what, the Kenyan Forest Service. And it's a very sophisticated plan. You have to hire a forester, effectively. That has costs. So all of this means that people don't get those rights. And so we really, I like to advocate that, if you're going to devolve rights in a meaningful way to communities, forest agencies their roles have to be rethought. They're no longer a regulatory agency primarily. They have to defer to the judgment and leadership of the right holders. And so that kind of reform of the agencies hasn't happened in many cases, and it really needs to happen if people are going to realize the benefits of their rights. This is, I think, it should be on the agenda for the GLF and for governments and donor agencies and so on. It's sort of reform of the agencies. And there's a lot of goodwill in the agencies, but they're constrained by the kind of a regulatory regime that's quite aggressive sometimes. Looking for the right word.
Okay, thank you very much, all the panelists. I think I would like to raise some few issues here, or maybe what we have learned. First of all, when we are talking about land ownership, it's not just having the paper or not just having the land title, but it's about controlling the resources that are on the land. So I think this one is very important. If you own land title and you don't have control over the resources that are on the land, that ownership does not really suit the real sense. And secondly, people have raised a lot of issues that are very, very interesting. Here, what we can really understand is that there is a need to really address landscape restoration issue in Africa. First, the land restoration needs to be human rights based, first of all. Second, it needs to be gender-based responsive. And third, it should tackle the existing policies and land tenure systems. And fourth, I think it should think about the notion of participation. And I think for that to happen, especially as far as indigenous people and local communities are concerned, there is a need for a landscape restoration strategy in Africa. So especially for indigenous people and local communities. So I think this is one of the messages that we really want to pass to the donors or to the participants that are here, that I think indigenous people and local communities in Africa need a land restoration strategy. And this strategy should take into consideration their specific needs and their specific rights. So, and this one, I think this is the key message that we are really sending out to those who are present here. And we think that we can send it to CIFO to carry it up. Yes, I think because this need to be done. And for this also to realize itself, I think indigenous peoples, organizations or associations need to be empowered. We need a lot of capacity building to fight against this. So ladies and gentlemen, once more, we really like to thank your participation, your active participation, your attention. And for all the panelists, we really thank you for your valuable and quality interventions. And hopefully we will do some networking while we are still here today and tomorrow. With that, I would like to thank you and say we are really, really, really honored for your presence. On behalf of the Indigenous People Major Group, we say thank you. Bye.